Welcome to Food Microbiology once again, and now we will be seeing factors influencing growth and kind of microorganisms in food. What are the parameters which influence the growth of microorganisms in food? Now, when we talk about the factors influencing growth, you have to keep in mind that will be responsible for spoilage or may be beneficial for the growth of microorganisms. So which are the factors which are affecting the growth? There are two, we can broadly categorize it into two, that is the intrinsic factors and the extrinsic factors. Intrinsic factors are the inherent components of the food. They are present within the food. They include pH, water activity, oxidation reduction potential, means the capacity of donating and receiving the H plus ions from the environment. It may be with respect to chemicals, the air, whatever it may. Light oxidation is also there, and thus it affects the quality of the food. Nutrient content of the food, what is the basic composition, whether it is a polysaccharide material, it is a lipid content is high, protein content is high. These components, they determine the quality of the food in the end, because those will be the parameters on which the microorganism will grow and thrive. Most of the foods, they contain antimicrobial contents, the biological structure which determines the type of microorganisms which will be growing. These are the intrinsic parameters. So I'll repeat once again, just pay attention. Inherent characters, embedded characters in the food, they include pH, water activity, oxidation potential, the reduction potential, nutrient content, the basic composition, antimicrobial components. They play because they will not allow the microorganisms to grow, and quality of the food may be better. Biological structure, similarly extrinsic components, that is all the factors which are outside the food. We will see it in detail as we move on. So first, let's focus on the intrinsic factors, factors which affect the microbial growth in food. As I said, H plus ion concentration means we have a huge variety of microorganisms which are growing in variety of conditions, like they are alkalophiles, neutrophiles, acidophiles. Depending upon the pH of the medium, that particular type of microorganism or a bacteria may thrive on the food. So the inherent composition of the food, inside the food, what is the pH? I will give you some examples so that you will get a fair idea of the pH of the food. Now pH of the food can be an intrinsic parameter as well as extrinsic parameter, but as we are seeing here, intrinsic, I mean to say what is the inside of a food. If you are talking about citric acid, let us say a citrus fruit or a tomato, naturally the inside of it will be a bit acidic. Likewise, there are many fruit juices which will have a pH which is alkaline in nature. Then moisture content of the food, some foods they are high in moisture content, some foods they are dry. Accordingly, nutrient content of the food, basic chemical composition of the food, antimicrobial substances, biological structures. One by one we will dwell into a bit more detail. You know very well, most bacteria, they like to grow in neutral pH, or let us say a slightly alkaline pH, which is just below the range, maybe 7.5 or between just 6.8 to 7.5. Some bacteria, they can grow within a narrow pH range of 4.5 to 9. That is, when I say a narrow pH range, it is the parameter which is maybe broad for the growth of microorganisms, but for food preservation techniques it becomes very difficult. Some bacteria like salmonella, they can grow at 4.5, they can grow at 9. Other microorganisms like yeasts and molds and some bacteria, they grow within a wide pH range, that is between 1.5 to 11. Try to understand. While yeasts, they have 1.5 to 8.5. So 4.5 to 9 is a narrow pH range for the bacteria, and 1.5 extremely acidic, and 11 is highly alkaline. So there are microorganisms which are acidophilic in nature, there are neutrophilic in nature, there are microorganisms which are alkalophilic in nature, and these grow on the type of the food which contains the inner pH value of the food is determinantal here. So the first parameter, which is intrinsic to the food character, which affects the growth of microorganisms in food, is the H plus ion concentration. If you see here some of the pH values intrinsically which are inside the food, beef if you take, of course this is processed food, pH range inside a beef is 5.1 to 6.2, chicken it is 6.2 to 6.4. see, it is in the acidic range. Okay, most of them they are in the acidic range because this has a intrinsic property. When it is processed, when it is added with certain preservatives, most of the preservatives they are acidic in nature, so these have range which is either acidic or near neutrality. Milk it is 6.3 to 6.8, cheese highly acidic 4.9. so therefore you can see on cheese, bread, etc., the molds they grow, yeast is used, fungi and molds they grow on such dairy products. Fish 6.6 to 6.8, oyster 4.8 to 6.3, so on and so forth. You will have a wide variety. Vegetables they are usually having a wide pH range, that is 3 acidic to 6 near neutrality. So these are the intrinsic pH values which determine which type of microorganisms and how many number of microorganisms, the kind of microorganisms which may not only reside on the food but whether depending upon pH plus other parameters will be they able to grow and multiply in the food or not. Microorganisms which are capable of growing in acidic environments, as I just said, they are called as acidophilic microorganisms. These microorganisms they are able to grow at a pH of around 2. Yeasts and molds usually they grow under acidic conditions. Penicillium species, Aspergillus species, these are some of the most commonly found fungi which grow under acidic conditions. Other microorganisms such as Vibrio cholerae are sensitive to acidic conditions and they prefer alkaline conditions. Mostly the food is infected with Salmonella, Shigella, dysentery, Vibrio cholerae, etc. So that depends upon what is the intrinsic pH value of that food. But here, having said that, it is not an alarming state. There is no need to worry because even though if they are present, they are not indigenous microflora. That is, they are not present as a part of the food. They are added by some sources as we saw in the last lecture. And processing the food, cooking the food will eliminate a lot of problems will be solved. So other microorganisms apart from Vibrio, the Enterobacteriaceae member families can also be present, and most bacteria they are usually killed in strong acidic or strong alkaline environment. But also for this there are some exceptions like mycobacteria which grow in alkaline conditions. Minimum and maximum pH for growth of some specific organisms, as you can see here, that is the range in which they thrive. Of course there is an optimum pH value which determines the maximum flourishing H plus ion concentration for that bacteria. Escherichia coli can resist or can be found at 4.4 and also at 9. Salmonella enterica 4.5 to 8.8. You see molds, they can grow at 1.5 pH, highly acidic, as well as extremely alkaline, that is 11. So is the case with yeasts. Second intrinsic parameter responsible for the growth of microorganisms or the presence of microorganisms in food is moisture content. Moisture content is the available water. Simply the effect of moisture can be correlated or expressed in terms of water activity. Amount of available water for the microorganisms inside the food. If you talk about, let us say, banana is somewhat having more moisture content, so it is pulpy or fleshy as compared to, let us say, apple, okay, or a guava. So these are hard inside, water content is less. Similarly with processed foods also, if you see sweets, those sweets or bread, it contains certain amount of moisture which is made available for the growth of microorganisms. So the amount of free water in a food medium is the amount of moisture. Now relative humidity is a separate concept which we will see in extrinsic parameter. Here moisture content of the food is intrinsic, is an intrinsic parameter. And if you are talking about moisture which is out of the food, then that will be called as a relative humidity, which I will be just talking in the next slide. The amount of free water is very important for the growth of microorganisms, we know very well. If there is lack of free water, microorganisms will not grow. Water activity basically is a vital parameter which is defined as the vapor pressure of a food substance, that is the vapor pressure of a food substance to the water, to that of water at the same temperature. Last lecture I had mentioned this. It can be given by AW, that is water activity is equal to water pressure of the food divided by water pressure of the vapor. So this moisture content actually has a value. When moisture content is maximum, we call that value as 1. Means 100% moisture is value 1. If it is 0.5, 50% of moisture is there. Food products, they usually have a water activity less than 1. Less than 1 because naturally the food components, they form the remaining part of the food material. Even when we talk about the cell or the human body as such, we say we are 70% water. It is not actually H2O, but it is the liquid component or the moisture content which is measured in that percentage. A saturated salt solution, even if you make a super saturated salt solution, means go on adding salt into water till that no further amount of salt can be added, even that salt solution has a water activity of 0.75. So you can understand the moisture content, because water is there, it plays a very important role. Salting and drying, it reduces the water activity of a food product. No wonder salt is added, sugar is added in most of the food products as preservative. Salt is a good preservative, sugar is a good preservative because it helps in lowering down the water activity of the food contents. Now, if you see the water activity in some food products, we are talking about the moisture levels. Raw meat and milk, glass of milk, water activity is almost near to 1 because you don't have anything dissolved inside it. And the meat, raw meat 0.99, the lunch meat 0.95, ham, sliced bacon 0.9, and dried grains, even they have a moisture activity of 0.8. The water activity levels are significant, and growth of microorganisms is greatly affected by the level of water activity in the food. More is the water activity, more available it will be for the microorganisms for metabolizing the nutrient composition in the food. Whatever the nutrient composition is there, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, fats, that will be easily metabolized by microorganisms in the food if water levels are high. So high amount of water activity, greater will be the microbial activity and greater will be the spoilage. Inhibition of this growth will occur if water activity is lowered down. Okay, organism will have a minimum level of water activity which is needed for growth. A minimum level, optimum level you can say. If you bring it below that, means you go towards drier and drier foods will not have microorganisms. Moisture containing foods, they are perishable, they have to be consumed very quickly. So no wonder that if you go to a sweet shop, milk products, they say that it should be consumed within 24 hours because a pure good quality food will attract microorganisms because it is rich in nutrients. Microorganisms have varying minimum water activity requirements, means each and every microorganism is varying different in its water activity requirement, and this water activity will support the growth in different ways. Minimum water activity which supports the growth of microorganisms can be found in the table here, and as low as 0.8 in dried grains and spoiled molds. You can see the greatest level of water activity for Clostridium botulinum, Bacillus cereus, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, very common in foods, Salmonella, very common in meat and poultry products. They have a required water activity of 0.9 to 9.5. So this is the minimum water activity which supports growth of some microorganisms. Most of the foods as water, if you boil it, steam it, when you prepare, there is some amount of moisture which is absorbed by the, during cooling also it absorbs moisture and water activity is present, except from dried, for certain dried foods, peppermints, mint, uh, tablet or a mint chocolates like that. Not chocolate, chocolate have some water activity. Peppermints, they will have zero water activity and they will not attract any microorganisms. The next important factor which is responsible, intrinsic factor which is responsible, is nutrient content of the food. Don't forget, we are discussing the intrinsic parameters as a factor which affects the kind and growth of microorganisms in food. So the nutrient content of the food is very important, as the microorganisms, they require proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, water, energy, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, vitamins and all other minerals for growth. In general, you can say CHNOPS, with major and minor elements. So if the nutrient composition declares the food as a whole food like milk, so it becomes a very good platform for the microorganisms to grow. Different types of foods, they have different types of nutrient composition and they help different types of microorganisms to grow. What is the food? What is the type of food? If it is a milk product, there will be a type of microorganisms. If it is meat and poultry products, Enterobacteriaceae family member can grow. There is a risk of that. Milk such as foods such as milk, meat, eggs, they contain a number of nutrients. Their composition is rich and they allow the growth of wide variety of microorganisms. These foods, therefore, they are called as highly perishable foods, susceptible foods, or those foods which have a very low shelf life. Means you cannot store them for long in room temperatures. So we usually, what we do is that lower the temperature, put them in a refrigerator or add some preservatives, so on and so forth. Another intrinsic parameter which is responsible for the type and kind of microorganism in food is antimicrobial substance. Antimicrobial compounds in food, they inhibit the microbial growth. Different foods, they have inbuilt microbial, antimicrobial compounds, chemicals, such as if you see in milk, lactanin, anticoliform factor, it is an anticoliform factor, and lysozyme in eggs which inhibits the microorganisms. Lysozyme is an enzyme which inhibits or kills or removes the cell wall of a bacteria. It acts on the cell wall of the bacteria and kills the bacteria. This lysozyme is also present in human tears. So these are inhibitors. Lactanin is there in milk. These are in broadly categorized as bacteriocins. Most of the compounds, they produce antimicrobial compounds and they inhibit the microorganisms or other type of, what you can say, growing yeast, mold, fungi, etc., whatever it may be. So you can see the penicillium mold, it produces antibiotic penicillin which inhibits other gram positive type of bacteria, right? So these are the type of what you can say, inbuilt, inherent antimicrobial substances which are responsible for, the point is totally different, lowering down the number of microorganisms in food. Next, the final intrinsic parameter which is very important in determining the number is the biological structure of the food. Some foods and fruits, they are in such a fashion that they don't allow the entry of microorganisms in the food, like egg, coconut. They are designed in such a fashion that they have a covering layer. These are very easy examples, but for example, meat itself has fascia skin and other membranes like which don't allow the entry of microorganisms. Eggs, they have a shell and an inner membrane which prevents the yolk and egg white from infection. So the biological structure of the food also is a intrinsic parameter, the inherent character of a food which will be responsible for developing or not developing the type and kind of microorganisms in the food. Now the next parameter is extrinsic parameters. If you just see, this is, if you apply your common sense, these extrinsic parameters are those parameters where the food is either prepared, preserved, kept, consumed, etc. These are those factors where the parameters external to the food which affect the microbial growth. These include the temperature of the storage, presence and concentration of gases in the environment. What type of gas? If there is oxygen, nitrogen, or there is absence of oxygen, anaerobic organisms will be growing. I'll come to that. Relative humidity of the food storage environment, where you are keeping the food, what is the moisture content? Sometimes you need moisture, sometimes you don't need moisture. If you have to keep the vegetables somewhere, you need a certain amount of moisture. You can't preserve the vegetables in a very dry and hot condition. Whereas if you are talking about some other type of foods, maybe the moisture is not needed. So extrinsic parameters are very important, in which the first is temperature. The growth of microorganisms is their microorganism is highly affected by the environmental character, is temperature. On that basis, there are psychrophiles, thermophiles, mesophiles, various types of microorganisms. They are able to grow at certain temperature, and when there is one temperature which is optimum for a certain organism, other type of microorganisms cannot grow in that. Bacteria therefore can be divided into various groups depending upon their optimum temperature needed for growth. You have seen this in your BSc first year, but still I would like to just recap the things. On the basis of temperature on the food, that is extrinsic parameter of the food, psychrophilic microorganisms, you know what are psychrophilic microorganisms, but the perspective here is what is the environment outside the food. If it is cold, think about food in a refrigerator. There the temperature is so low, 10-20 degrees to minus degrees centigrades. Okay, you will have psychrophiles growing there because they grow best at 20 degrees, but they can also be tolerating minus 10 degrees centigrades. And these psychrophilic bacteria, they can cause food spoilage at low temperatures. Several microorganisms found in soil, water, they are found in soil and water, but when they are brought into refrigeration conditions, they can grow and they can just spoil the food. Second, mesophilic bacteria, very common, 25 to 40 degrees centigrade, which is usually our Earth's temperature and where we function, where we live, where we eat. This temperature are optimum for the growth of these mesophilic bacteria. They grow very close to 37 degrees centigrade, which is our body temperature. And some organisms like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, very common food contaminant, may grow even at low temperatures between 5 degrees centigrade and as high as 43 degrees centigrade. None of the mesophilic bacteria are able to grow below 5 degrees centigrade or above 45 degrees centigrade, because below 5 they will be called as psychrophiles, below 45 they will be called as thermophiles. Most pathogenic bacteria, means those which can grow inside our body at 37 degrees centigrade, they are found in this group. Pathogens are mesophiles. The next group is thermophilic bacteria. They grow above 45 degrees centigrade. The optimum temperature ranges between 50 and 70. There are certain bacteria, extreme thermophiles, which can grow at 80 degrees centigrade. At this temperature, spores are also formed, and I would like to add that these spores, they resist, and when they get favorable conditions, they will germinate into vegetative cells, grow in their numbers, and then cause food spoilage. Bacteria of thermophilic group, they are mainly spore formers, remember that, and they are of very significant importance to the food industries, especially in the processed foods. You have to note here that the effect of temperature on the microbial growth also depends upon the environmental conditions like growth factors in the nutrient medium, pH of the food, and water activity. The second extrinsic parameter which is responsible for the growth and type and kind of microorganisms in food is the concentration of gases in the environment. What does this mean? This means the presence and concentration of the gas in the environment is responsible for different types of microorganisms growing in the food. Microorganisms which are associated with the food when they are in immediate contact with their environment which contains oxygen. Oxygen tension is one aspect where aerobic organisms they grow. If the oxygen tension is low and zero, you talk about oxygen tension, the amount of oxygen which is available as a gas and the pressure of it which can be made available for the microorganisms can be categorized into three categories: high oxygen concentration, medium oxygen concentration, and no oxygen concentration. This is responsible for the growth of aerobic microorganisms, microaerobic organisms, and anaerobic organisms. The most of the food spoilage is caused by anaerobic type of microorganisms. Some microorganisms, they may grow at high oxygen tension also, or in the absence of oxygen tension also, both. These are called as facultative anaerobes. All these microorganisms, they carry out the spoilage of food. Food is affected by various types of groups of these aerobic and anaerobic organisms. Aerobic or facultatively anaerobic organisms, they are also spore formers, and they grow in canned and packed foods. When the foods, they are packed inside it, there becomes no way for the oxygen to transfer, and some preservative gas is present which creates anaerobic condition. And during packaging, if unfortunately an anaerobic organism has been added or a spore former has been added, then when the anaerobic conditions flourish, they will germinate into vegetative cells and cause more and more spoilage of the food. So when you open the can, you get a pungent smell, and it immediately signals that the food has been spoiled. Similarly, microaerophilic bacteria, they are most likely to grow in vacuum packed foods, those foods where the air is removed out and vacuum sealed is done. Their microaerophilic bacteria, they may grow because they have a low oxygen tension requirement. And similarly, aerobic bacteria, they grow on the surfaces of food like raw meat, they grow on the surface. And aerobic molds, they will grow in insufficiently dried or insufficiently salted products. So foods are affected by various types of oxygen and gases conditions. Finally, the last of the parameter which is responsible for the spoilage of food and which is extrinsic is relative humidity. Now this is something related to water activity. Water activity is the intrinsic parameter, and relative humidity is the extrinsic parameter. So which is in contact with the food. Relative humidity is the amount of moisture in the atmosphere or the food's environment, and water activity is which is inside the food. Intrinsic, that is the basic difference, but the activity action result is same. Foods with low water activity placed at high humidity, think foods which are having low water activity, that is intrinsic, but placed at a high humidity levels, will take up that water and increase the water activity inside, and they may spoil the food. For example, if the grains are very dried grains, we usually sun dry the grains on a terrace. Okay, sun drying is there. If you sun dry it, bring it and place it in an environment where there is huge moisture, like somewhere near to a bathroom where more water is there. So it will start absorbing the water. If the storage room is attached to a wall and bathroom and wall and common, then there will be moisture, and that will if the grain is stored somewhere like that with a high humidity, then it will take up the water. There will be growth of mold, fungi, etc., and they will spoil the food. So this is all about the factors affecting the type and kind of microorganisms in food. Now in our next video, we will be seeing the significant microorganisms which play. What are the microorganisms? I will give you some examples, some names of microorganisms and their significance of microorganisms in their food. Do they spoil it? Do they enhance the food quality? So on and so forth. So that's all, dear friends. Now I hope you have understood this lecture well. Again, I repeat, pause wherever necessary. The best way to listen to these lectures is pause before I speak, read the slide, play the video, then while listening to me, don't read. While reading, don't listen to me. How not to listen to me? Pause me. Pause, read the slide, then take down the notes. Remember, I will be conducting MCQs based upon these points which I have just explained. So all you have to do is listen carefully, understand very well, and make an idea out of it. Create your own imagination, own ideas, notes. Refer books. If you want, I can upload some books. You can use internet and any other resources. The basic aim is to get enriched with the knowledge of food microbiology. Thank you once again.